Week 2. In this week we focus on systems thinking and system dynamics. To start off with, we have the interactive lecture. The first time around we allocate some extra time to this activity as not everyone is ready. Okay, so let's have a look at the interactive lecture questions and some of the key points to discuss. So in the first question, why are systems counterintuitive? So there's at least two arguments to be made here. First, the leverage points of a system can be easily pushed in the wrong direction. Second, because of the complexity of systems, the location of leverage points can be counterintuitive. Question 2. Why should we concern ourselves with the stocks and flows of a system? Okay, so for this question, it is important to be clear about the definition. Stocks and flows are two types of variables we are interested in modeling a system, especially if we are making a stock and flow diagram. So a stock would be a variable that accumulates a level of a quantity of some type, and a flow would indicate some change, and it would be represented by a rate of change somewhere in the system. Both of these are important if we are interested in understanding how the system behaves over time, and in the case of system dynamics, if we're interested in quantitative modeling of the system. Okay, for question 3, why does Meadows think that tweaking numbers is a weak approach to intervening with the system? The idea here is that while you might adjust the equilibrium of a system by tweaking a constant, for example, the behavior of the system doesn't fundamentally change. The dynamic of the system doesn't fundamentally change. You may simply shift the equilibrium a little bit, or in some cases not much at all. As a counter-argument, you may say that while numbers might not be the strongest method for intervening in the system, they are one which people are quite comfortable with. Generally, if we look at organisations, numbers are front and centre in many decision-making processes, whether we like that or not. So while this might not be a strong method for changing a system, it is one that is much more readily accepted. For question 4, I found something in the chapter that was perhaps easier to relate to for students. The question here is about changing rules as an intervention into a system's dynamics. So looking at one of the suggested changes, what if there were no degrees? Everyone came to uni to learn something they're interested in and went on their way, rather than having a package of subjects as a course. This would be a fundamental change. The obvious consequence would be that students would like it, on the one hand, but perhaps they would only enroll in a few subjects. It's hard to predict what would happen exactly, but it's clear that it would fundamentally change how a university operates. The counter-argument here is that while changing the rules would fundamentally change the dynamic of the system, it doesn't necessarily lead to an improvement. So for example, choosing your subject sounds really nice, but if we want something like professional accreditation, it's not really a matter of choice. When you go see your doctor, you hope that they've studied anatomy, pharmacology, and all of these other subjects. It's important. Likewise for engineering and many other professions. Also, you would likely see people hyper-specialising because they choose only the subjects they're interested in, which would limit their ability to work on anything cross-functional. As I pointed out last week, even if you're pursuing a technical career in IT, you still will benefit from having a general idea of business and various topics around that. But if you had complete choice, you would more likely choose technical subjects. So for question 5, Meadows points out that an individual business will tend to want to grow and win in some sense, whereas a higher order goal is to maintain competition in a market. We might even say that market competition is in service of a high level goal, that being improving the quality of life for people living in that society. The argument Meadows makes is that if you let the lower level goals of the system dominate, you will fail to achieve the high level goals. One angle for a counter-argument here is that the different levels of the hierarchy are represented by the interests of different stakeholders. So any attempt at intervention is likely to see disagreement between the different stakeholders because they simply have different interests. You might also present a counterexample, such as the Australian domestic energy market. Lots of regulation, ostensibly to promote competition, so in service of this higher level goal as an intervention, but does it work? Now you can look up on consumer rating websites some of the key providers. So you look up, say, AGL and convert the score to a percentage, and you find that they have a customer rating of 10%. Not so good. You look at one of the quote-unquote competitors, Origin Energy, 8%. Even worse. So yes, we have interventions in place to promote competition, and yet they don't seem to work. So even though, according to Meadows, it's a good place for intervention, we can find examples where those interventions don't work. Question 6, why do we need to understand feedback loops to understand a system? A simple answer is similar to question 1, because systems are counterintuitive. But there is a bit more to it than that. So feedback loops, that is chains of effects that in turn affect the original variable where they started, they are important to understand situations where a particular effect is amplified, as well as situations where a particular effect is constrained. When we model these, we call these reinforcing and balancing. That is important if we want to be able to make any reasonable predictions as to how a system will behave under a given change. The counter-argument here might be that not all effects in a system form feedback loops. So we might be intervening in a part of a system which is more linear, and therefore understanding feedback loops doesn't help us to better understand that part of the system. For question 7, North points out that language is very linear, which makes it difficult to express situations where multiple things occur in parallel, which happens in many forms of diagrams. If we are looking at causal loop diagrams in particular, everything in the diagram is occurring in parallel. All the forces exist in parallel, and we really don't have a very easy way of expressing that in written language. There are several counter-arguments here, perhaps pointing out some of the situations where written language fares as well or better than a diagram. Also, there are situations where we want to express great levels of detail, and that can become really messy with a diagram. For question 8, what is a positive connection on a causal loop diagram? These connections indicate that when one variable changes, the connected variable changes in the same direction. Now, this could be an increase matched by an increase, or a reduction matched by a reduction in the target variable. You can think of the plus or minus as a positive or negative correlation coefficient, but with a causal direction. One thing I would suggest if you are drawing these models for the first time is to use the S and O notation. The reason being that the plus and minus can make you think increase, decrease, which in some circumstances will be wrong. Question 9 is similar, except of course the connected variable is changing in the opposite direction. For question 10, to determine whether the loop is balancing or reinforcing, you need to look at the connections around the loop. If all of the forces are positive, that is, all of the effects are in the same direction, you will have a reinforcing loop. If an odd number of forces is negative or in the opposite direction, you will have a balancing loop. I would encourage you to work through an example with multiple negative connections to see why that is. Moving on to the rest of the lecture. Today we are covering systems thinking. This is a set of practices which enhance our ability to understand systems in a broader, more holistic way. Now, of course, when we say something's holistic, it's very often used as a buzzword, as you might have experienced. However, systems thinking really does live up to that label, as I hope you'll see. One way of looking at how we can contrast systems thinking with other types of thinking is Russell Ackoff's distinction between analysis and synthesis. So analysis being the scientific approach to reasoning, where we look at objects and break them up into smaller and smaller components, and by understanding the individual components we improve our understanding of the whole. Synthesis is the opposite. We look at an object in its environment and understand how it relates to that environment. By doing so, we'll discover things which we wouldn't see if we simply were to dissect the object. One common definition of systems is in regards to purposeful systems. That is, systems as being defined by one common purpose, as we see here. We also need to call out the colloquial use of the word system here. I'm not quite sure why, but well, in common usage, system is short for computer system. And I'm speculating, but I can only imagine that the extra 3 syllables were too much for people. So rather than saying computer system, now people just say system to refer to a computer. Not very good for communication. If someone calls you and says, hey, I have a problem with the system, that's not very helpful. If you instead say something more specific like, hey, I have a problem with the software, I can't connect to the database, etc. Each of these statements is more useful. That being said, I think we have to live with the usage of the word system being the way that it is, at least outside of what we do in this class. To understand a system, I would suggest that you ask a lot of questions. In the class we would actually discuss each of these questions one by one. They are pretty straightforward and you can apply these to any sort of system, not just a truck. For the question about components, we use Russell Ackoff's thought experiment as an exercise. Separately in groups we have students identify one of the components of the vehicle and then search for what is the best component in that class currently available on the market. After a bit of time with that, we move on to the next 2 questions which highlight Ackoff's argument. Simply optimizing the individual components of a system does not necessarily improve the system. In fact, we would not even have a vehicle. We would have parts ranging from sports parts through to actual truck components. They don't fit together and therefore we no longer have a working system. An organizational example would be a department trying to optimize its speed. To locally optimize the speed of a department, we might, for example, batch up some of the work that they do. So similar work is grouped together and processed as a batch, rather than piece by piece. That can be more efficient in terms of time. However, if we look at the broader organization, this can mean that the end-to-end process now takes longer because some of the requests in need of processing are waiting to be batched up before they are processed. So now everything is delayed. And you can find other similar examples of local optimization reducing the performance of the broader system. So that's an example of how some of this thinking achieves that claim of being more holistic. Russell Ackoff published several books, mostly in regards to organizations as systems. He highlights many principles such as those listed on the slide here, and in particular focuses on the interactions within a system. He highlights that the interactions themselves are a useful unit of analysis rather than the individual parts of a system. Returning to the vehicle example, Ackoff would ask which component carries out the function of the system. If one of the functions of the vehicle is to get you from A to B, well, the engine on its own can't do it. It can't even move itself. And likewise, the wheels on their own, they don't do anything. It's through the interaction of all the components when they're brought together that the system has the ability to carry out its function. One of the useful acronyms in systems thinking is POSIWID. The purpose of a system is what it does. This comes from the observation that we often apply labels and imply purposes for systems which may not be completely accurate. Or perhaps from the fact that different people will see systems as having different purposes. So the idea of the acronym is to re-examine the system based on its behaviour rather than the labels that have been applied to it. Now, in discussing examples in the class, we look at some obvious ones, such as the university itself. The classic purpose of a university is, as an institution, to dispel ignorance through education, research, etc. But what other purposes might we infer from its activities? If we look around, we see a lot of promotion and a lot of effort by the university to attract students, from which we might infer that the purpose is to sell as many degrees as possible. But it doesn't end there. If we look at some of Akoff's criticism of the university, he points out that the way the university is organised could be seen as fulfilling a different purpose, namely the provision of comfortable positions for academics who occasionally have to pay the price of doing a bit of teaching for the privilege. Now, whichever way we look at it, it's obvious that there are many purposes that we can identify for a system, and depending on who you speak to, you will hear a different story. So examining the dynamics of a system to try and understand what the purpose is, independent of what labels people present, can be a good idea. Now we can go one step further and ask the question of, does the system have a purpose at all? I prefer a shorter definition, calling a system a causality network. You all know the story. If a tree falls in a forest and there is no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? The same question could be asked of a system. Does it have a purpose if there is no one there to observe it? If we exclude purpose from the definition, we're left with two features. The system is concerned with cause and effect relationships, rather than merely process and sequence. And it is also concerned with complex relationships, non-linear relationships, rather than simple causal chains. At this point, we introduce one of the key tools we use in the class for systems thinking, the causal loop diagram. Again, I would reiterate that for anyone using causal loop diagrams for the first time, you can avoid some mistakes by using the O and S notation rather than the plus and minus notation. One of the key features of a causal loop diagram, as the name implies, is feedback loops. Here we can see two types of loops, reinforcing and balancing. A reinforcing loop is one where a force amplifies. In this case, a population grows over time. In practice, few systems grow indefinitely, and rather they achieve some sort of equilibrium. So the question is, what is the limiting factor? For a living species, such as the birds here, predators. The available habitat would also limit the potential expansion up to some equilibrium. So apart from the individual forces in the diagram and the loops, we also indicate the delays in some of the forces. This is done with perpendicular lines on the arrow. The next diagram is a rather messy one. This was a bit of a thought experiment I had a few years back. I was interested in joining two different models of how companies pursue sales. The direct approach being advertising as a way to garner sales. The other approach being relying on word of mouth if you have a good quality product. So taking these two ideas, I thought, how can I bring these together into a single model? And here's what I came up with. Now, even though this is getting a little bit more complicated, it's clear that there are things missing from the model. For example, the quality of the offering is sitting there without any antecedents. Sure, we could also include product development and investment in such. So we might have extra variables for the profit connected from sales and investment in development. And we might of course include many other variables. What is obvious, as with any model, is that we have to choose our scope. Now let's have a look at an example for the Sydney trains, which we've been discussing. So I have two models here, examining two different aspects of the same system, which again relates to the idea that we can have different scopes depending on how we're trying to look at the system. In the first diagram, the model is focused on the preference between driving and using public transport. What is depicted is the equilibrium between road usage and train usage. It also shows a potential solution by notifying passengers of where seats are available on the train. We can follow the model to see how this would tilt their preference towards using trains rather than driving. However, this in turn would mean there would be fewer cars on the roads, road congestion would decrease, which over time would tilt the preference back towards road transportation. In the second model, we consider a different change. That is the adoption of working from home schemes. The key variable here is the pressure on companies. Employees frustrated by commuting to work would of course prefer to work from home. Another pressure on companies is real estate costs. If you can have every employee working from home 1 day a week, that means you only need space for 80% of them. But what happens if we take this to the logical extreme and everyone works from home? One, we would eliminate congestion because there would be no commuters. And two, the office rental market would crash because there would be no one renting offices. Now clearly the system would reach some sort of equilibrium before reaching that extreme. So that's what we're showing in this model here. Now, depending on time, we would invite students to draw models for their own assignments in the class. Finally, we briefly contrast system dynamics and systems thinking. System dynamics takes things one step further by creating quantitative models of systems. Rather than causal loop diagrams, stock and flow diagrams capture the stocks and flows of a system. You will recall that these are the variables which accumulate a value in a system, as well as rates of change between variables. I'd love to get into some of the quantitative modeling in the class, but it is outside of our scope. For next week's interactive lecture, we have 2 chapters from the improvement guide. And the questions we have focus on some of the quantitative elements of defining a problem and understanding it, as well as the demarcation between improvement and project.